This is, you know, I was in this room yesterday, same time, but I didn't have competition. I was up against, now I'm up against Agata. I know she's in like Salon 3. Great talk, I've seen it before. But you know, like, be as comfortable, as spread out, as German as you'd like to be. But if you do feel like squishing in, like, you know, that's okay. That's okay. Come on in. Come on in. The water's great. This is a thing that I like to talk about a lot, which is Battle of the Year, which is something that your country actually started. Battle of the Year happens once a year. It's an international breakdancing competition that happens either in Paris, actually not Paris, but it happens either in France or Germany. You know, so different countries compete. Spoiler, the South Koreans always win. South Koreans are excellent at breakdancing. And once I tried to figure out why is it that South Koreans are so excellent at breakdancing? And I didn't figure out the reason why. I never learned why South Koreans as a people are fantastic at breakdancing. What I did figure out is that if you live in South Korea, if you're South Korean male, and you come of age, you know, it's time for you to pick up a gun. It's time for you to go to the border and, you know, stand at the North-South Korean border and you know, defend your country. And there's no way out of that. If you have a child, that's not a deferment. If you're a teacher, that's not a deferment. If you have any sort of like physical ailment or handicap, that's not a deferment. There's no way out of military conscription unless you're really, really good at breakdancing or you're really, really good at StarCraft. Those are the two ways to get military deferment. And they were trying to figure out, why is that? Why is that like a legal deferment for military service? And they never found out the reason. But what they did find out was that a few of the senators, the Korean senators' sons, happened to be really, really good at both StarCraft and breakdancing. So it's an odd coincidence. It's an odd coincidence that just benefited several people. But anyway, Battle of the Year, it's super fun to watch. I would recommend it, as well as recommending turning on your clicker before you start to click things. But hey, my name's Lemon, and I make websites. If you were in my talk yesterday, I brought a little bit of this up, but I've been in ceaselessly impressed with the internet of a way of being a place that sort of democratizes speech. And I say that knowing that that's a big concept, you know, like, though this is the democracy of speech, but like, it's still true. Like, FTP still works, and it still works fucking great. You know, I can just spring together some sort of HTML thing. I can use tables, right? I don't even need to use styles. I can just go HTML, P, my dumb thoughts, UL, several of my dumb thoughts and LIs. And I can do that. I can FTP that up. I can just go, well, I'm going to commit that into a GitHub repo and use GitHub Pages, and it's going to publish it. Like, there's no other medium that does that cheaply. I started working in the very beginnings of my career. I started working in magazines because I wanted to hang out with musicians. And that's really what it was. I wanted to hang out with musicians, and I thought that like working for a magazine would be that thing. But like, that wasn't democracy, right? Because like, it's expensive to print magazines. I work for a company called Sass Labs, and I am the front-end development director. That means that my job is as much about coding as it is about helping other developers reach their potentials, having regular check-ins, regular one-on-ones with them. What are your actual goals, and how can we get there? And how can we, when we're taking a project and thinking about like what the actual project scope is going to be, and what the client thinks that they actually want, like how can we start by not making stupid decisions, because at some point in the process, if people are making stupid decisions early on, eventually those stupid decisions turn into requirements, and now it's somebody's job to do it. So like that feels pretty good. So my job I would describe as like mentoring, shepherding, and documenting, as well as writing code. And so, I feel a little bit fancy. Getting to like stand on the stage every once in a while and talk about, my sort of opinions on how the web worked. But while this might be like what life looks like for me now, like this was me back then. A part-time bartender working at it. That's not a real gun, just to say. That's not a real gun, which is good, because that night, had it been, who knows how that night would have ended. But I was a part-time bartender, working at a job, trying to find a gig wherever it was. I was as good at kind of as slanging together a website as I could be, but I sort of like was working for different like contracting companies and trying to find, the company that would be willing to hire me to kind of do this thing. And this is a true story. So I'm working for this contracting company. They're just sort of sending me out. I'm interviewing, it's okay. And I was in that situation where like, it was kind of exciting, right? To be able to be a contractor at that level where like, I didn't have to know anybody's name. I would show up at a job. They wouldn't have any idea who I was. And I didn't really know. They were just like, hey, we need you to make this website for a cereal brand. And I was like, okay, cool. And they were like, it's Kathy's birthday. And I was like, I don't know who Kathy is. And they're like, do you want cake? I'm like, yeah, cool, I want cake. So I took a job sort of like in that vein of just trying to work for a company. And essentially what they said to me was this, like we have this legacy software platform, it's built in Ruby on Rails, which is fine. Ruby on Rails is totally fine. But the thing that they had built had a lot of problems with reliability, and it was hideous. It was hideous. So they wanted to rebuild the entire platform. They hired a .NET developer, and they wanted to rebuild the whole thing. And so between myself and the .NET developer that they hired, we kind of slang this thing like together. And so in that short amount of time, I built a front end. I worked with the developer, or the .NET developer, and said like, what do you need? What do I need? What's the sort of handout layer going to be? And we sort of decided that like once it got to the CS HTML, which is the razor kind of way to do HTML, that's when it's on my camp. So anything that happens before that HTML rendering, that's your responsibility. Once it's after that point, that's my responsibility. And so I was trying to just make something. I was trying to make something that I wanted to try to make something quick. So I used Bootstrap, and I used Knockout. I'm guessing fairly amount of you are familiar with Bootstrap. Maybe not so many of you familiar with Knockout. I don't like either of those at this point in my life. But that was the way to do things because I wanted to do it nice and easy. And I built the entire framework in a month, meaning that, day after day, I would just kind of clock in and slang out this sort of thing. And as this happened, and as I met people, and as I met my boss, who was terrific, I started to like these people. And they were like, and they liked me. And they said like, hey, like, do you want an actual job? Like, do you want to like work for us? And I was like, you know what? Like, I've been just kind of bouncing from one job to another, and like that feels sort of okay until I have those periods of unemployment, and then that doesn't feel super duper okay. So like, you know what? I like you. Like, yeah, let's make this work. I'm going to take this full-time job. And then I thought, oh, shit, because that software that I had made for a month, knowing that this was about to be somebody else's problem, it's now my problem. This bullshit software that I built, I now have to be the one to maintain it. Is anyone here named Jeff? Is anyone here actually named Jeff? Okay, that's really good, because if your name was Jeff, this will get weird for reasons you'll understand in a moment. But this is Jeff, and Jeff does not exist, by the way. Jeff is a picture from this person, does not exist. But Jeff overcomplicates things. And I've worked with many versions of Jeff throughout my life. People who don't tend to ship code, but tend to have a whole bunch of opinions about your shipped code. and Jeff is your enemy. So we're going to talk about frameworks real quick. This is not a talk about frameworks, but like there's a whole bunch of them, right? Because like a client's going to say, hey, we're going to build a website, and then Jeff is going to say, well, okay, well, a website, we're going to need a framework to build a website. Like, slow down, Jeff. Slow down. We don't need to do that first. Because like there's Bootstrap. Bootstrap, of course, was created by Twitter back when Twitter was a thing. And it was a float-based layout. Crucially, it was a float-based layout that didn't break that often. As long as you kept the sort of like row semantics of like clearing those floats, it did a row-based layout that was all right. And, you know, Bootstrap, you know, sort of famously has a look to it. But that's not the only one. There's Foundation. Foundation is made by the same company that does an actual really good HTML layout kind of thing, because writing emails in, writing emails in HTML is hard. It's very, very hard, and you have to do a whole bunch of weird trickery. Foundation actually has a pretty good one for writing HTML emails that I like, but they also have a website version of that. Cirrus is one that I've used at some point in the past, and it's a CSS only. It's lightweight by framework standards. Like, there's Element Plus, which is a Vue 3 model, which is fine, but like everybody loves Google, with some exceptions. And of course, what does Google have? They have Material, and there's like a million Material kind of versions, right? You've got MUI Core, which is a React one. You've got Angular Material, which is the Angular 2 one, which is different than the one that's called Material Angular, which is the Angular 1 one. Awesome job, everybody. We've got Vuetify, which gets used a fair amount. That's the Vue sort of one. We've got Materialized CSS, which is the only CSS one. It doesn't actually have packaged JavaScript. It doesn't look the way that you think it's supposed to. And like Carbon is the one that's made by, I want to say Carbon is the one that's made by IBM. I think that's right. And that's going to work with React or Vue or Angular, but realistically, it's actually just React. And then we've got like Primer. Primer is the GitHub one. The interesting thing about Primer is that GitHub works, and this is a credit to the entire GitHub team. GitHub actually works 100% without without JavaScript enabled. It works less elegantly than you might expect, but if you actually just turn off JavaScript and use github.com, like all of the markup is such that like it will still work operationally. You'll be able to do all of the same things. So that's what Primer is meant to sort of like emulate. And there's like a whole bunch more. You got Metro, you got OneSyn, you got YUI. Remember Yahoo? They kind of still exist. We've got Jeet, we've got Kickstart. A bunch of these have crosses because like a bunch of these are deprecated. And if you happen to make a website using that framework, like, sorry, because I hope you don't want to update it at this point. Because like we have this concept of this trade-off, which is that simply if we want to start off with a bunch of velocity, and we know that we're going to do something where we've got a project and it needs to get off the ground really soon, and we've got, like, for example, like this very simple like form-based layout, and we just want to get it done in like a week, and we don't have, wait, where's theirs? That's what I was looking for. Variable CSS fonts. It's kind of a cool thing. But if we've got a situation where we kind of just want to get something off the ground fairly cheaply, then those frameworks are great. But at the point that you want to change stuff around, at the point that you need to maintain this for years, that starts to become a problem, because all of those assumptions that were based on, like, would that look, those get more expensive. If you have a material-based design and you want to change the way that corners are rounded, hey, that's going to be a day. It's literally going to be a day to change how much the corners are rounded in a material design, because a lot of things are contingent on that exact border radius. Also, the actual like packages end up being huge. So anyway, this is not a talk about frameworks. This is a talk about two things, and that is HTML and Sass. And when I say Sass, I'm just presenting Sass as a way that I personally write CSS. Nothing about this talk is specifically about Sass. I'm just presenting it as a way to mention that we can truncate our things down. I write Sass. I will continue to write Sass for quite a while, but there are a whole bunch of modern CSS features that are starting to and are pretty close to making Sass kind of irrelevant, which is great. That's great, because we don't necessarily need those things. So the first thing I want to talk about is viewport units. So if we've got, for example, like a div, and that div has a width, we can define that width in a whole bunch of different ways. There, we can define that a width is 500 pixels across. We can define it as 50% across. Percentages is where CSS starts to get weird, because if you want to define something in percentages of width, you're in great shape. If you want to present something in percentages of height, hey, you actually have a problem, because you might be calculating width when you meant to be calculating height. We've got the concept of ems and rems and chs, which are variables that say, you know, this is based on a character. M should be like the size of the letter M. A ch is the size of lowercase o, I think that's right. And then we've got the kind of like sort of grid-based concept, which is a fraction. And we're going to get to that a little bit later. But we've also got this, which is VAW and VH. So that means that, listen, I don't know what's going on with this particular viewport. You're the computer, but what I know is that I want to have 50% of the width and 50% of the height. And then they had to complicate that even further to introduce the concept of DVH and DVW. Simply because if you're, for example, on like Safari on your iOS device, and you've got the like address bar, and the moment you scroll, the concept of 100 VH actually changes, because 100% of the height changes whether or not that thing's on screen. So if you're actually doing something with, like you want to take the full screen, you actually want 100 DVH, because that way you get to compensate for the sort of address bar and whatever sort of like browser crap you want. So we got a client there, and the client's saying, like, we like that design where everything's just a single slide, and then when you scroll down, you see another slide. Jeff wants a framework for that, but like, shut up, Jeff, we don't need to do that. So we're just going to do some mains, we're going to do some sections. That's really all we're going to have. Just a main, and that main is going to hold a bunch of sections. And then our Sass in this point is we're going to say that every section is going to have a minimum height of 100 VH. And so in so doing, we end up with this. And this is a responsive thing, meaning that no matter what I actually do as my browser size, like that stripe is going to be 100 VH. And as I scroll to the next one, that stripe is going to be 100 VH, and this stripe is going to be 100 VH. And that's like cool, but there's something that I snuck in without telling you, and that's that I added this. So in my section itself, I did this thing just to kind of like center the text inside of it. That's cute. Hey, I centered something in a div. Awesome. But I also actually did this, which is that I created the concept of scroll snap. And when you do that, you can actually say, if somebody's scrolling through the page, then I have this preference of where I want things to stop. So if I've got several sections, and those sections have hard lines, and if somebody's scrolling, I want to prefer this. Now, you can do that with JavaScript, but it'll feel fucking terrible, because you're going to scroll, and then that JavaScript is going to grab the actual scroll bar and yank that thing back up. So instead, what we got in this case is a situation where I've got my stripe, and I'm going to kind of like scroll this thing down, and it's going to try to prefer to snap that thing back in place. Now again, I'm not doing this with some sort of like weird JavaScript trickery, and I can actually define the margins of flexibility to say, like, you know, be kind of soft with that scroll snap or be a little bit harder with that scroll snap. But I can do that to say, you know, hey, if the user's kind of close to here, I would actually prefer them to be here. Okay, so like that's cool, but like let's move on to the very concept of like parallax, right? And parallax is a big old topic, and there's a whole bunch of different ways to do this particular thing. But if we've got a situation where we just want to do something where we've got an image, and that image is going to say static while the text moves behind, we can do something like this. So we've got our scroll snap, we've got our min height, but now we're just going to kind of like add, say, a pseudo element. And that pseudo element is basically going to contain an image, and that image is going to be position absolute. And then we're going to do a background gradient, right? Now, again, parallax can mean a whole bunch of things, and that's going to depend on like what a design is going to say. But if we want to do something nice and cheaply, we can actually do it like this. So we've got our main, we've got our section, we've got our content, and then we've got our inner. I had to do that so that I had like the idea of some offset that you're going to see in just a second. But now we've got sort of like these images and these quotes from Rick Ross. And essentially, we've got these different panels being pulled in from Unsplash, and we've got our content that gets to run independently of that. And there's different ways we could do that to like do watchers for if you had a situation where you had like clouds or bubbles or whatever, then you can do those kind of things with code that's going to be more complicated than I can show you here. But we don't need JavaScript for literally anything inside of Parallax anymore. There's not a situation. Never mind. I was going to say there's not a situation I can think of where you actually need JavaScript for Parallax, and then like 3 came to me. But the cheaper stuff, the simpler stuff, you actually probably don't need that situation. So let's move into the concept of grid layouts. I'm so sorry, that thing just keeps falling. Move into the concept of grid layouts. And we've got this like new website, and it's going to have a top nav, it's going to have a sidebar, it's going to have a footer, and like, well, I guess we're going to need a framework. Shut up, Jeff. Jeff, I'm sick of hearing from you because what we got is something that we can do really, really easily. So we've got our div here. I'm going to have my div say that we've just got a general page layout. I'm going to have a header. I'm going to have an aside. I'm going to have a main. I'm going to have a footer. Semantic HTML really does help you if you're doing that. Like, if you can try to avoid just writing div if you don't have to write div, you're going to thank yourself later. But in that case, we're just going to say, OK, we're going to define the concept of your sidebar, our 260 pixels on the left, and then our 1FR, meaning whatever you have left. You're a computer. I don't know. If there's some sort of weird Sony Trinitron monitor that goes forever, I want 260 pixels of that to go into the sidebar. I want everything else to go to the side. And then for my header and my footer, I'm going to say, in this case, I want you to span 2 columns. So I've created 2 columns, our 260 and our everything else. And then I've said to these other things that go full width, span both of those columns. And in doing that and that alone, like we have this concept of like, here's our top nav, here's our sidebar, and then here's our footer on the bottom. Now that's the one way that we did that. There's another way we could have actually done that, which is we can define in a grid what our template areas are. So you can actually define variables. Every time you're defining a grid, you can name your template areas to say that my header is always going to go in the header section. So now you don't need to define, for example, like you're going to span 4 or you're going to span 3. You just get to change around those variables and call those things in a way that's like a lot more substantial and understandable to the next person that has to come through and touch that CSS. Repeating grids are something that I use all the time, and like we've got this request here, and we've got our page, and our page has a whole bunch of blog teasers. There's going to be an image. There's going to be a headline. There's going to be some tags. I don't know how many there's going to be, but we know that it has to be responsive. This is the kind of thing we run into all of the time. And so, of course, like, shut up, Jeff. OK, listen. We've got this design, and this is the design that we want to enact. So we've got a thing where it's 3 across, and then we've got this concept of the actual mobile view. And like, as I said before, there is a middle point that we need to kind of think about. We don't want to have a situation where we go from 1,100 pixels and just like snap down to a mobile view, at like a ridiculously large array. So we're going to define our cards here, and we're going to have our article with a class of cards. And we're going to say that we've got our grid. It's got a row gap that's different than the column gap because we want a bigger gap in between that we want above and below. And now we're going to create this thing where we're going to say, if the min width is this, then there's going to be 3 columns. If it's this, there's going to be 2 columns. If there's this, going to be 1 column. You want to start to expand that out to super, super, super big monitors. You go ahead and do that thing, and then we're going to define our actual card. And in so doing, we've now created like a simple responsive layout. So we've got our 3 columns, and then as we try to find the handle, there it is, OK. So we're going to go into the concept of like 2 and 1, and we're probably going to like play squeeze box, play the accordion with this thing to get it to the point where like, okay, this is now kind of like what I'm looking for. But we kind of created a little bit of a problem here. Because if we look at this thing, we've got the situation where like, that's pretty much what the design wants, and that's pretty much what the design wants. But like, here? I don't know, it's a little weird. And like, here? A little bit weird. Like, can we improve these things? Yes, of course we can improve these things. So our designer came back and said, okay, so we've got these cards in a single column, and we want that to look different. But obviously, we don't want to change any markup. We just want to change the actual CSS. Well, that's not hard at all, because inside of our grid, we've got another grid. So we've got our grid defined as like a single column with a font size and a figure. I did that margin top so that there's a little bit of it popping out of the actual card itself. And now we're going to say that this different breakpoint is going to change what the grid looks like inside. So now I'm creating a concept of 3 different columns of like different widths. We're going to have a rule that I'm going to get back to in just a second. But then we're going to change one of the very coolest things about, well, there's so many cool things about grid, but one of the things that I really like a lot about both grid and flex is that you can change order without changing the actual HTML. If I have a grid concept and I've got like headline and I've got picture and I've got link and I've got like all of this stuff, I can actually redefine order 1, order 2, order 3 without actually changing the HTML around. It's just going to change the display without changing the DOM itself. So we've got this situation now where when we get into our sort of single column layout, we're going to be snapping into like this look, which ends up looking a little bit more friendly. Now there's a thing that I could have introduced at this stage, which is the concept of container queries, which I really just cut for time. But container queries are very cool and genuinely have great browser support. So I would recommend doing some Googling on container queries, because at this point, if you're talking about grids inside of like little concepts, container queries are ready to go. They're something that you can use right now with a lot of confidence. So we're nearly there, and people like it, but like, we want to do this other thing, so, right? We want to do this other thing where we've got our card in a grid, and then we've got our single column, but we want to like change around like alternating steps left and right. And the idea of us wanting to move our publish date and our author date, you know, sometimes clients are clients. And when clients are clients, sometimes they have weird-ass requests. And sometimes you go, why you want to do that? I'm going to break for a story real quick, which is to say that like I was working for, I'm not going to tell you the kind of company, but what I am going to say is that they were a company that existed in New York near Niagara Falls. As you know, like Niagara Falls, waterfall, it's pretty. And their nearby competitor had a camera that they pointed at the waterfall. And they just had that picture of like their property looking very pretty, sort of like, and the waterfall itself. And so my client, who was a competitor to this, they were mad about that, because they had this thing on their website of like, look at how pretty they have this webcam. We want that. And I was like, cool, but you actually don't have a view of Niagara Falls. So like, what you want to do about that? And they were like, yeah, but we have another idea. We have another idea. What's that? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take a webcam and we're going to point it at our parking lot. And I was like, okay, gotcha. So I see several hundred problems with your plan. First of which is the actual legal implications about like people's own, you know, personal information of like their license plate and not necessarily wanting those things kind of like broadcast over the internet. People have, I don't know if you know this, restraining orders because sometimes people don't get along very well. And now all of a sudden, like I just learned that Sheila's in the parking lot, maybe you're the cause of a crime in this case. There are so many legal and ethical problems with having a webcam pointed at your parking lot. And I said, I don't understand what the upside is, because I can understand somebody looking at a webcam of a parking lot and going, it looks dead in there. I don't feel like going. And I can understand the concept of somebody looking at a parking lot and going, it looks too crowded. I don't think I'm going to go. But I don't understand the use case of somebody who's on the fence about going to your particular establishment and goes, man, I'm not sure if I feel like going today. But if I look at oh, dude, that parking lot looks amazing. You know what? I wasn't going to go, but I want to park in that parking spot right there. Let's fucking do it. And so I said, all I see is downsides. I do not see an upside. Can you explain to me, please, what's the business logic? And she emails me back, and she says, no business logic. I just think it would be cool, smiley face. Sometimes clients win. So we've got our situation now where we've got our nth child, and we're basically just going to start to move some orders around. We can do this with all the flexibility that we want. If we've got our concept of like our news website, which is absolutely inundated with ads, first of all, ad blocks exist, and just we have to know that. But also we can recognize that like we don't have to change around our HTML. We can just play with our orders and create this sort of system where when we get into this layout, we can go left and right without a whole lot of change, or really any change to our markup itself. Okay, so we've got some links, and those are cool, but like we want a hover state. All right, cool, let's see what the design looks like. All right, well, here's what our design looks like for our actual hover state of our card. It's a little obnoxious, but like I think we can do that. You know what? All right, never mind. I'm just going to sit down here because, I might have had an idea of how to do this particular effect, but Jeff's going to do it. All right, cool. So let's see what you got, Jeff. Okay, well, he's got a transform, and then he's going to do some negative margins on 3 different things. Boy, I can kind of see what's going to happen here. And I'm a little worried. All right, Jeff, you know what? Fuck it. I'm a man of optimism. Let's see how this looks. Oh dear. Okay, well, if we scroll down, Jeff. Okay, well, we can't stand that. So let's do that, and let's try to make this a little bit more straightforward. So there's the concept of a transform, and the cool thing about a transform is that if you're familiar with the concept of like how the DOM works, there's the concept of a browser paint, which is there's a bunch of HTML, there's a bunch of CMS or CSS, and then the browser goes, okay, I'll figure it out, and it'll paint. And so it's going to do that. At the point that you start to change rules, like margin, padding, whatever, the browser has to repaint. And when you're doing stuff where you're changing paddings and margins, you're creating a situation where the browser has to repaint tens of thousands of times. Computers are fast. That might be a limit. A transform actually offloads all of that stuff onto the GPU itself. It says paint stays the same, but we're going to take this transform and we're going to allow that to change. So there's a lot of ways to do this. You can translate something on the x-axis. You can translate something on the y-axis. You can do both at the same time. But 3D does actually exist inside of CSS in kind of limited capacities. There was a Mozilla project called A-Frame that I still mourn because there was some really cool stuff that they were going to do with WebVR, and I really want something like that to come back. But there is some 3D that exists inside of CSS that works out pretty good. So you have those like sort of flip effects and all of that sort of stuff. We can change skew, we can change perspective, we can change matrix. This is a thing that I only know about intellectually. This is definitely not a line of code I've ever written. In fact, I'm not really sure what that variable is, to be honest. But I do know that there's a lot of different concepts of transforms, but crucially, all of these things are offloaded onto the GPU. They're offloaded onto the GPU to be faster, meaning that we've taken that thing out of the DOM, and now we can just change the visual display without actually changing the browser paint. So we're going to do that, and we're basically going to say we're going to create this transition. My box shadow is going to change, but that's never actually going to affect any sort of like DOM layout kind of thing. And then I just want to make it slightly bigger. I want to change it on the y-axis a little bit. And doing that, and only that by itself, we've now created this situation which, I mean, that's obnoxious. Like, if this was an actual, like, you know, production website, I'd be like, well, can you tone that down a little bit, buddy? But, like, it does actually come out the way that we want it to look, where these things fly out and don't wiggle on the DOM and change some other values. So we've got this other design to look at. And we've got our desktop, we've got our mobile, and again, this is great, but there's a thing that happens in between this that we need to think about. And so what we don't want to do is have a situation where we say, okay, well, this is 64 pixels, and this is 28 pixels, and we're just going to breakpoint that kind of thing, because that's going to have limitations, and it's going to create some weird, squishy middle points. And so what we can do is we can introduce the concept of a CSS clamp. I use this so often for typography, especially headline typography. But it's really a matter of we have a min, we have a max, and then we have our baseline. So if we have, for example, the concept of an H1, we'll say our H1 is going to be a minimum of, I don't know, like 1.75 rem. And our maximum is going to be, I don't know, 4 rem. And then we're going to say that our baseline is going to be something like 3.5 VW. And actually, I ended up with this, where I had like a 32 pixel on one side, I have our 4.7 VW, and I have our 76 pixel on the other side. And in just doing that, and really that alone, and not needing to write any queries, be it media queries or container queries, I end up with this situation, which is that my headlines are going to max out at this size, so I can go as wide as I want, and it'll stop growing at this point. But once I get into here, you can see how the actual text is going to shrink down. And it's going to shrink down until it reaches that minimum point. So we've got our min, we've got our max, and then we have our squishy middle. This definitely will take a minute to just kind of look at the actual value, play squeeze box with your browser, and use a little bit of like interpretive logic. But once you get there, you can write so much less code by just creating this clamp design. So we need a form, because I saw Rowdy's talk yesterday about forms, and I figure like that's pretty fucking easy. So I'm going to build a form, because I think that now that I've learned how to build a form, I think I got that all covered. So what? What? Oh, no. All right, fuck you, Jeff. Let's do this. Okay, all right. There are several sins in this form. Number one is we're using placeholder as our actual label. Do not do that. You're going to lose concepts of what those things might be. We've got our birth date as just a general input type text. So like, I hope you type in the right, oh no, we did actually do it as a date. All right, well that's kind of cute. Is our password secure? Well, that's fine, okay. We've got, what is that? And then, I don't know, why are you asking me? And then, okay, there's a bunch of things wrong with this form, including like an input type range that is unlabeled, so I'm not sure what I'm filling out, but it feels kind of neat. But one of the things that we've definitely lost is the concept of hover and focus states. So I don't really have a great idea of where I am in this particular form. So, Jeff, with all the respect you're due, which isn't a whole lot, we're going to improve this form. So we've got a div, and we've got our input, and we've got a placeholder. We're going to just change that to a different situation, where now we're going to have a field set. We're going to have our input first and our label second. I'll get to why in just a moment, because I know that that's a little weird. We're going to have our input first, we're going to have a label second, and then we're going to have some Sass. And the reason why we did input label second is that what we want to do is change around the order to say the order of label goes above input, even though those things are in reverse order in the HTML, so that when I'm in hover and focus states, the corresponding sibling of label is actually going to change color. We could have done that a cooler way, which is we could have done that with the concept of has, but I wanted to show a slightly less cool way because, you know, has is a little bit new. It took a little while for Mozilla to come up with this. So now that we have like this sort of situation, we now have a better form. And a better form is a form that you can use your actual tab input for. I do not like a form that I cannot tab through. So if I go tab, okay, there's my name, and there's my email address, and I've used my input type email, meaning that this thing is actually going to validate on itself, so it's going to at least know the syntax of an email, knowing what that should be. I've got my like input type date that I can fill in the way that I want. Rowdy and I have some slightly different opinions on this, but here's the thing. I don't want to care. Like, I'm from America. We do dates wrong. We do dates wrong, and we will continue to do dates wrong because the country that I come from uses the concept of inches and feet, and we won't stop doing it. And I do not know why. And everybody knows that kilometers makes more sense, but we still talk in miles. And then when we have a concept of like, well, how many pounds are in a like a teaspoon? I don't know. You know, we're going to just sort of like use these things. And so that's why I just want to have an input type date so that I don't have to think about that, so that saner countries can put in their dates correctly and my American computer will still understand them. We've got our password, we've got our input type field, we've got a number input with a little spinner, which, you know, people have sort of different opinions about, which is totally cool. But did I actually need to ask your gender? If we've got that on a form, and we know that that's a thing, can we realize that, yes, I have a form. I have the ability to ask thousands and thousands of questions. I am a person that's writing software that's going to ask thousands and thousands of questions. Also, shit gets breached all of the time. All of the time. Did I need to ask your gender? Am I doing anything with that, or am I just making that form worse because I asked your gender? I don't want to know your gender, or at least your own expression of your gender, unless you want to give it to me. And I'm not going to make assumptions. I also, crucially, do not ever want to know your credit card. Okay, speed round. All right. So we've got an iframe. There's the concept of an aspect ratio. This used to be really terrible math that you had to do, where you had like, you know, like an iframe, and you would like put it inside of a container, and you would go, okay, so inside of this container, there's going to be a position relative thing. The iframe itself will be a position absolute. Then I'm going to say that my div is going to have a padding top of, if I can do this by memory, I feel like it's 56.25% in order to like, no, that's silly. We're beyond that. CSS is better than that. As long as we know the aspect ratio of the thing that we want to display, we can just use that aspect ratio. We can do that for iframes. We can do that for images. We can do that for any HTML element that we want. And in so doing, we've created the system of a responsive iframe with a, handle. Come back. There we go. There we go. So we've created the concept of a simple responsive iframe with literally one line of code. We've got this concept of our content with rail. We've got our position relative, and then we have our sticky element. If you have that thing where you've got your little section, bookmark, breadcrumby kind of thing, you can do that with a position sticky element. This is, again, pretty much a single line of code. As long as we have our position relative, and we follow some grid and flexbox rules in the container, we can have this situation. So my top nav, or my like hero element, looks like this, and then I've got my little blue like navigation thing, and the moment that reaches where the rule says it's going to reach, it's going to just lock itself into place. This used to be a thing that took a whole bunch of JavaScript. It no longer does. Next concept is this, the concept of clip paths. So we can actually say we've got our image, and maybe our image is not particularly, it's more complicated. If we've got some, we can do some background text with like a ping, for example, but pings are really, really huge, and if you're looking for roster fidelity, those pings can be huge. You start to do WebB, you can trim some bits off of there, but once you start to do like transparent backgrounds, that can be a problem. But maybe we don't want to do that at all. Maybe we just want to do our actual HTML and just create some clip paths in there. So I'm going to show a concept of divs that are just using these clip paths in and of themselves. So we've got our little slice out of it, and like that's kind of cute. We've got our little parallelogram, which I've found a lot of designers enjoy doing because it just looks different. It breaks the concept of boxes. And so we can get cute with that, right? We can go into like this little arrow thing. We can go into a bunch of different shapes. We've got triangles. We've got like hexagons. We've got stars. We can kind of do anything that you would do in Adobe Illustrator. Anything that you can do in Adobe Illustrator, asterisks, curves are going to be a problem. But if you want to do the concept of just shapes in general, you can do that with a CSS clip path and do that pretty succinctly. These are all background JPEGs that are just clip pathed in. But we can actually combine that with the concept of a float. And I know floats are a problem, but sometimes floats are actually the right answer. So if you've got our shape outside, we can define our shape outside with the concept of, for example, a polygon or an ellipse or whatever. And if you don't know where I'm going with that is this. So we've got our actual headline text, and now we're going to just define, hey, I want you to float around this particular thing. We're going to draw a shape, and that's going to be the shape outside, and then we can just have everything float around that section. So if we've got, like, for example, like a little triangle here, it's going to float around that. Our little triangle here, it's going to float around that. And maybe, like, we just want to float around DJ Khaled's head, like, which is actually a kind of perfect ellipse. We can just do that thing. There's things in Jen Simmons' labs where she has situations of like literally floating around individual grapes. Like all of the stuff is actually quite possible with just drawing these CSS shapes and working from there. So where do you go from here? There's a whole bunch of options, but really it's just time to get cooking. There's a lot of places to go. First of all is the complete guide to CSS Grid. So CSS Tricks was bought by DigitalOcean, and there's some problems there. But the great thing is that all of the actual content that used to exist on CSS Grid, on CSS Tricks, still does. So all of those really great reference materials that are on CSS Tricks, including this one single page of every syntax that you want to know about Grid, exists right here. I will have the slides sent out later on, but we can do that as a single page, get all of those properties. That also exists for Flex. Flex is equally cool. One of the things about Grid getting a whole bunch of limelight, which is great, is that people forgot that Flex also exists. And Grid is great, and Flex is great. And people don't need to make decisions, because a grid is a solid grid. A Flex is a flexible box. And both of those can be the right answer. Bennett Feely has this thing called Clippy, which is not the Microsoft Clippy. It's a different Clippy. It's a CSS clip path maker. And so essentially you can just like sort of draw the concept of your CSS clip path, and maybe you want to use, this sort of shape or whatever, and you can kind of like play with this. And then eventually down here, you're going to get this like copy-paste little bit of CSS that you can use inside of your code to define what that CSS clip path is going to look like. We've got the Sass documentation, which is really, really good. If you've ever actually looked through the Sass documentation, splitting out partials and making something that's production ready really works well. And then this talk, and this is a screenshot of this talk. inside of a screenshot of this talk, inside of a screenshot of this talk. I'm very, very clever. But ahoylemon.github.io /pure Sass if you're looking for this talk right here, which I definitely edited about an hour ago from my hotel room. You can just go to this URL, go through those slides, and you are all set. And of course, just like hit me up. Of all of the languages that exist in the world, CSS is the one that I enjoy the most. So email, I don't use that thing anymore. I don't know what that thing's called. I look at Mastodon, although it's kind of dead, but like Sessionize, GitHub, and like here, man, I'm around. Just come find me. I love to talk about CSS, and I happily will with you. So this is me. This is my lovely daughter, and thank you so much. And if you did like this talk and you go to the DevMio app and you give me a good rating, I would appreciate it. If you didn't like this talk and you go to the DevMio app and you give me a bad rating, hey man, that's okay too. I mean, we all need to learn. Am I perfect? No, absolutely. But I would love if you got your feedback. So thank you. This is my website, and I have less stickers than I had yesterday, but I still got some stickers. So if you want some lemon stickers, you want some Sava stickers, I've only got like 3 sane stickers left, and I do not have any more. Maybe you don't need as much JavaScript as I had. I don't have any of those left. So therefore, if you email me, go to the website, or you just email me, and you're like, hey, I'm at the talk. You didn't have stickers. Give me a sticker, motherfucker. I know how to do that. I know how to do that. So let me know.